welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we're starting a series of instructional videos to teach you how to play Kingdom Death Monster. Now these are going to be going through the actual rules of the game. I'm not going to go through the prologue because I feel like the prologue is pretty well laid out for you in the instruction manual itself at the beginning of the book. So instead we're going to be going through just the overall rules in detail of how to play this game. Now there are a lot of rules for this game, so I'm breaking it down into 5 different videos. This is the survivor video that we're going to be talking about today. It's going to be going into detail about the survivors themselves. The other videos will go into other aspects of the game, and you can find links to all of them in the description below, as well as timestamps for the different sections of this video in the description below as well. So without anything else, let's get right into how to play Kingdom Death Monster. The first thing a player will need to grab for her survivor is the survivor record sheet. Each survivor has a survivor record sheet that keeps track of essential information players will need to hunt, fight, and interact with the settlement. And speaking of the settlement has its own sheet as well. There's a lot of writing in this game. You're gonna want to use a pencil. Players use minis to represent their survivors on the hunt and showdown boards. These 4 minis are the starting survivors and represent them in their most primitive state. Survivor minis don't need to accurately represent the gear a player is using in the game. It's more important for players to be able to easily recognize which survivor is represented by which mini during the game. Each survivor needs a name. This gives the survivor substance and can help create a sort of emotional connection between the player and the survivor. Survival is the desperate desire to cling to life. Survival is gained and lost throughout the campaign and may be spent to perform extraordinary feats and hopefully change the survivor's fate. When a survivor is named, she automatically gains 1 survival. As the survivor's amount of survival increases and decreases, update the survival box accordingly. A settlement has a maximum amount of survival any of its survivors may have and is recorded here on the settlement record sheet and is known as a survival limit. At the start of the game, this limit is 1. Once the language innovation is gained, the survival limit is increased to 2. You can see here it says survival limit plus 1, and so the players will change this limit to 2. If a survivor would ever gain survival in excess of the survival limit, that extra survival is lost. In the first story, the only survival action the survivors have is dodge. In the first story, the only survival action the survivors have is dodge. However, throughout the game, survivors may eventually gain dash, encourage, surge, and endure. When a survivor has access to an additional survival action, players notate that by filling in the box next to it. Just as encourage was learned by the settlement adding an innovation, the other survival actions will also be learned through the settlement adding certain other innovations. Survivors have 6 attributes: movement, accuracy, strength, evasion, luck, and speed. A survivor may gain permanent increases or decreases to their attributes. When this happens, the controlling player should update the value in the appropriate box on the record sheet. For instance, if the survivor gained plus 1 permanent strength, the player would notate it in the box like this. If a survivor gains temporary modifiers to her attributes, place the appropriate token on the record sheet instead of changing the sheet itself. So if the survivor earned plus 1 accuracy but not plus 1 permanent accuracy, the player would take this accuracy token and keep it near her survivor sheet. These tokens are double-sided, and so if the player instead had lost 1 accuracy, she could use the other side to indicate that. Keep in mind that permanent changes will remain until told to be altered. However, tokens will be removed at the end of a showdown. A survivor may also gain bonuses to her attributes through various gear and weaponry. For instance, the monster grease gives the survivor plus 1 evasion. While not required, I recommend jotting these bonuses down somewhere on the survivor sheet near the appropriate attribute for easy reference during the game. Normally what I'll do is, in this case, I would put a 1 above that evasion. I've also seen it suggested that you draw a line through the box like this and use one side for gear bonuses and one side for permanent changes. Let's take a closer look at each of these 6 attributes. As is indicated on the survivor sheet, a starting survivor's movement is 5. Movement is the maximum number of spaces a survivor can move in a single action. For instance, this survivor could move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces to do a full move. A survivor's movement attribute is simply the maximum number of spaces that survivor can move. However, survivors are allowed to take any number of spaces less than that if they wish. Survivors may gain and lose movement throughout the course of the game, but a survivor with less than 1 movement may still move a single space. Movement is also the only attribute that does not start at 0. Accuracy is added to a hit roll to determine if it is successful. So in this case, a 9 would be considered a 10 because the survivor has +1 accuracy. It is possible for accuracy to be negative, in this case -1, in which case it would be subtracted from the roll and make this an 8. The strength attribute is added to a wound roll to determine the force of the attack. Like accuracy, strength may also be a negative number. Evasion is added to a monster's attack profile to determine the difficulty of the attack. In this case, the monster would hit the survivor on a roll of 2 or higher. However, with the 2 evasion, it's now a 4 or higher. As with accuracy and strength, it is possible for evasion to be a negative number as well. Luck increases a survivor's chances of inflicting a critical wound. Normally, a critical wound can only be caused by a lantern 10. However, with luck 2, the player could cause a critical wound with a roll of 8 or higher. And again, as has been the trend here, luck can also be a negative number. The speed of a weapon determines how many dice a player will roll when attacking with that weapon. The Founding Stone has a speed of 2, so the player would roll 2 dice. However, with a speed attribute of +1, a 3rd die would be used. Speed may also be a negative number, but a survivor or monster will always be able to attack with at least 1 die. A survivor has 5 locations that are affected by physical damage: head, arms, body, waist, and legs. A survivor may equip armor to each of these locations as well. In the top left corner of armor is where the player will find any armor points granted by it. In this case, the cloth grants 1 point of armor to the waist location for this survivor. If a survivor has no armor on a location, then that location has 0 armor. Hit locations have a light injury level and a heavy injury level. The exception being the head, which only has a heavy injury level. Anytime a player fills in a heavy injury box, that player is knocked down. Anytime a player would need to fill in an injury box, but they are already filled in, so in this case, if another head injury occurred, and this one's already been checked off, the survivor suffers a severe injury. We'll talk more about severe injuries in the abilities and impairment section of this video. The brain location is not a physical location and instead represents the survivor's mental fitness. The brain can only be damaged by brain damage, which is considered different than physical damage. It's important to note that there is only a single injury level for the brain, located here. Insanity protects the brain location in much the same way armor protects the hit locations. The more insane a survivor is, the less likely she is to be shaken by the horrors all around her. Insanity points are gained and lost throughout the campaign. If a survivor has 3 or more insanity, she is considered to be insane. As with all other stats on the survivor sheet, be sure to accurately update the insanity level as it fluctuates throughout the campaign. Let's talk a little more about severe injuries. When a survivor's armor and injury levels are exhausted for a particular hit location, such as the arms here, she will begin accumulating severe injuries if she takes additional damage at that location. The player locates the severe injury table for that location on pages 86 or 87 of the rulebook, and then rolls a d10 to determine exactly what sort of horror has befallen her. So if the player took an additional damage to the arms and rolled a 5 with a d10, that would mean that she had suffered the ruptured muscle severe injury and would then have to follow the directions indicated in the rulebook. Severe injuries can be temporary, though others can be permanent. When the survivor suffers a permanent injury, the player notes the name of the injury and associated rules on the survivor's record sheet and adjusts the survivor's attributes as necessary. If that injury is ever healed, the player erases it from the sheet. If, on the other hand, the severe injury is not permanent, then the effects last only until the end of the hunt. The player should mark the survivor sheet with the appropriate attribute tokens to indicate the effects of these injuries. Survivors gain hunt experience during the aftermath of a victorious showdown. Record the hunt experience by filling in the next unfilled checkbox. Anytime any of these heavy-lined boxes are filled, a milestone has been reached and the age story event has been triggered. Players can find the age story event on page 107 of the rulebook. The number of milestones filled indicates which age rules apply. So for the first milestone, players will use weapon proficiency. The second milestone, improved reflexes. The third, enhanced senses. And the fourth, lucky elder. If the final hunt XP box is ever filled in, the survivor has grown too old to hunt and must retire. A survivor may also be forced into retirement by certain severe injuries. Retired survivors may not hunt or participate in showdowns. However, they still contribute to the total population of a settlement and may participate in settlement events and endeavors. If a survivor does manage to reach this first Hunt XP milestone, she will gain a weapon proficiency. The survivor selects the weapon type she wants to become proficient in and writes the name on this line. The weapon type is a keyword found on this line beneath the weapon's name. Here you can see that the rawhide whip is, as you might expect, a whip. A survivor may gain proficiency in the following weapon types: axe, bow, club, dagger, fist and tooth, my personal favorite, grand weapon, guitar, shield, spear, sword, and whip. During a showdown, if a survivor wounds the monster at least once with her chosen weapon type, she becomes eligible to gain 1 level of weapon proficiency. Then, during the aftermath, if the survivors have been victorious, eligible survivors gain 1 proficiency level. Simply fill in the next unfilled weapon proficiency box to indicate this. Survivors must select their weapon proficiency prior to going into combat in order to gain a proficiency level during the aftermath. A survivor may change her selected weapon proficiency type when she departs for a hunt. If she does, she loses all accrued levels of weapon proficiency. Including any specializations she may have gained. Erase all filled boxes and start over with the new weapon type. When a survivor reaches the specialization milestone, she gains the benefits listed on the specialization card for that weapon type. When a survivor reaches a weapon mastery, she gains the benefit of the mastery located on the opposite side of the card, and it is permanently added to your settlement as an innovation. The survivor is so masterful with that weapon that she has passed on the weapon specialization to all current and future survivors of that settlement. So just to be clear, once a survivor has mastered the dagger, all future survivors for that settlement and all current survivors will have the specialization of the dagger, which we saw a moment ago on that side of the card. The survivors now gain not only this specialization, but also any proficiencies that they earn on their own. However, if another survivor wishes to gain the benefit of mastery of that weapon, she will need to earn all 8 weapon proficiency levels and does not actually start at the specialist milestone. Courage and understanding will aid the survivors throughout the hunt and showdown. Certain events will require certain levels of courage or understanding to even be able to participate in them. Courage represents the survivor's potentially ill-advised bravery, while understanding represents her insight. Both have milestones indicated by the heavy checkboxes, and these trigger the listed story event the first time the survivor reaches that milestone. So in the case of this milestone, the story event bold, or this milestone, the story event white secret. Keep in mind that even if somehow the survivor loses enough courage or understanding to drop below one of these milestones, each milestone may only be triggered once per lifetime per survivor. Fighting arts can be learned from certain innovations and events. Some fighting arts have a cost to use, and some may be able to be activated instead of a weapon. However, fighting arts usually have exciting effects. Each fighting art has a corresponding card which describes it in detail. If a survivor gains a random fighting art, shuffle the deck and draw one at random. When a survivor gains a fighting art, record it on the survivor record sheet. And in addition, make any notes next to it that you may need to help remember how that fighting art works. A survivor may have up to 3 fighting arts total. If a survivor gains a 4th fighting art and she wishes to keep it, then she must replace one of her current fighting arts. If a survivor were to gain a fighting art she currently already has, then nothing happens. Sometimes a survivor may lose the use of all of her fighting arts, in which case the player fills in this box. Secret fighting arts are maneuvers that cannot be gained randomly. Each of these is described in detail on the corresponding secret fighting art card. A secret fighting art does count towards a survivor's maximum of 3 fighting arts. The horrors a survivor experiences may cause the survivor to develop mental disorders. Disorder cards describe the effects of a disorder in detail. If a survivor gains a random disorder, shuffle the deck and draw one at random. Record the gained disorder on the survivor sheet and jot any notes next to it that you need to remember how that disorder works. A survivor may have a maximum of 3 disorders. If a survivor gains an additional disorder, one of the previous ones must be replaced, but the player gets to choose which one. As with the fighting arts, if the survivor gains a disorder she already has, nothing happens. The survivors may encounter various ways throughout the game to cure disorders. Throughout her lifetime, a survivor may gain abilities, severe injuries, ailments, and other painful reminders of her journey. Record these in the Abilities and Impairments section of the survivor record sheet. There is no limit to the number of abilities and impairments a survivor may gain. On occasion, due to certain events in the game, a survivor may be required to skip the next hunt. If that's the case, mark this box here. Some events will indicate they can only be used once per lifetime. In that case, the event name should be recorded in this space here to remind the player that that survivor cannot use it again. Also, if the settlement gains survival of the fittest, the survivors will gain the ability to re-roll a single roll result once per lifetime. When that ability is used, the player will fill in this box. Bleeding tokens can be gained in various ways, such as certain severe injuries, certain events, and certain monster attacks. If a survivor ever has a total of at least 5 bleeding tokens, she's dead. At the end of a showdown, remove all bleed tokens. The gear currently in a survivor's gear grid is what the survivor is wearing and carrying. The gear grid can hold up to 9 gear cards at a time. These cards may be organized in any configuration as long as all the cards are right side up. So even though the cloth is worn on the survivor's waist, it does not have to be in the center of the gear grid. It could be anywhere else on the gear grid. Same with the founding stone. Even though it's a weapon, it does not have to be in the left or right side. It could be anywhere on the gear grid. The only restriction is that you cannot rotate the cards on the gear grid. Also, the only time gear may be reorganized is during the settlement phase. On the left side of the gear grid, players will find a breakdown of the survivor's act, and then a description of the survival actions, and finally, a description of unarmed combat, which is always available to a player even if she has lost all of her other weapons. This is called Fist and Tooth. The rules for Fist and Tooth are listed right here in the bottom left corner of the gear grid. The rules for Fist and Tooth are listed right here in the bottom left corner of the gear grid in the same format as other gear cards. A survivor may not have multiple copies of the same gear in their grid, with the exception being weaponry. So while 2 claws would not be allowed, 2 founding stones would be. However, even if a survivor has multiple copies of a weapon in the grid, she may only gain the special rules for that weapon once. Duplicates of weapons will still contribute to affinities. We'll discuss affinities in more detail a little later in this video. And speaking of special rules, let's discuss them briefly. Special rules are located at the bottom of a gear card and include both special abilities and limitations. For instance, this bone axe has both the limitation Frail as well as a special ability Savage. The rules for lower level gear will often be explained fully on the card itself. As you can see here, Savage is fully explained. However, some high-level cards may only have the name of a special rule and will require the player to look it up in the glossary in the back of the rulebook, which starts on page 228. Underneath the name of the gear, players will find the keywords for that gear. Keywords are used to describe gear's important features. These keywords may be referenced by events, monster cards, and other rules throughout the game. So in this case, the keywords for the bone axe are weapon, melee, axe, and bone. If a survivor is wearing a complete set of armor, for instance in this case all 5 pieces of the rawhide armor, that set of armor will bestow the survivor with a bonus. This bonus is listed on the armor set card. As long as the survivor is wearing all the armor from that set, they have the listed benefits. Some gear abilities require an additional cost from the survivor in order to use them. Most commonly, this associated cost is spending an activation, as you can see here. However, other costs, such as survival or suffering damage, may appear as well. In this case, the survivor spends 1 activation to remove up to 2 bleeding tokens from herself or an adjacent survivor. It's also possible gear may act differently depending on certain stats the survivor may possess, such as being insane, a certain amount of survival, or certain levels of attributes. Let's take a closer look at the 3 main types of gear players will come into contact with during the game. Armor protects the survivors by increasing armor points at hit locations. Armor is worn by placing it on the survivor's gear grid. A maximum of 1 piece of armor may be placed on the gear grid for each hit location. On the armor gear, players will find the name of the gear's keywords, the number of armor points gained when worn, the hit location that gains those armor points, and any special rules for this armor. When a survivor departs the settlement, she updates her armor points on her survivor record sheet to reflect the armor she is currently carrying. If the survivor loses any armor during the hunt or showdown, immediately update the appropriate location to reflect this. The second of the 3 main types of gear are weapons. As you might expect, weapons are primarily used to attack monsters. On the weapon gear card, the player will find the name of the gear keywords. This lightning bolt indicates that one activation must be spent to attack with this weapon, the weapon's speed, accuracy, and strength attributes, and finally, any special rules or abilities. Unless otherwise noted, these will only apply when the weapon is activated. The third type of gear are items. Items have effects that can aid survivors in the hunt and showdown. Each has unique rules described directly on the card. On the item gear, you'll find the name and keywords, special rules for the card. Unless otherwise noted, the item rules are always in effect simply by having the item in the survivor's grid. However, some special rules require the survivor to spend activation to trigger it and will be indicated by the activation symbol like this. You may have noticed I've ignored a particular feature found on some of the gear cards. These half squares found on the card edges can be used to form affinities and come in 3 different colors: blue, green, and red. If a half square is directly adjacent to another of the same color, the complete square they form is one affinity, seen here. Some gear cards, such as Lucky Charm, have affinity bonuses that impart special effects on the survivor if the affinity requirements are met. Affinity requirements are indicated by a number of small colored squares in the gear's special rules, seen here. Each colored square represents one affinity that must be in a survivor's gear grid. For instance, Lucky Charm requires 2 blue affinities to gain its bonus. Currently, there's only 1 blue affinity in the gear grid, and so Lucky Charm's special ability doesn't do anything for the player. These 2 affinities may be located anywhere on the gear grid and do not necessarily need to be connected to Lucky Charm. So in this case, there's a blue affinity here and a blue affinity here. So Lucky Charm now has the 2 blue affinities necessary for the survivor to gain +1 luck. Some affinity requirements are represented with a colored puzzle piece rather than a colored square. For instance, the Rawhide Vest has a blue and a red puzzle piece. The puzzle piece indicates that in order to activate the special abilities listed, the Rawhide Vest needs to have 1 completed red affinity and 1 completed blue affinity directly connected to it, instead of them being anywhere on the grid. So, since we have a blue affinity connected here and a red affinity connected here, that meets the requirements for the +1 evasion, and the survivor gains that benefit. It's important to note that an affinity bonus can only be gained once per item. In other words, if a survivor had Lucky Charm equipped and managed to complete 4 blue affinities somewhere in the gear grid, that survivor would still only gain +1 luck. Also, if during the course of a showdown or a hunt, any part of an affinity bonus is lost and the necessary affinities are no longer present for that bonus, the bonus is immediately lost as well. And that completes our survivor portion of the How to Play series for Kingdom Death Monster. Check down in the description, like I said below, for the upcoming videos. If they are out, there will be a link in the description. If they're not, they will be soon. Keep checking back and we'll have the whole series out for you before you know it. Thanks for watching. I hope you come back for more. Consider subscribing to the channel to get updates, and if you really like this video, give me a thumbs up. Until next time, if you're bored online, bored offline.